Welcome back to another edition of the Edge Podcast. Managing editor Brenden Slaughter, joined as always by my recruiting analyst Jared Halus here for the Edge Podcast at beaversedge.com. Well, folks, signing day officially in the rear view mirror. December signing period came and went. February signing period came and went. The Beavers have the crux of their class. Jared and I will be breaking it down. We'll also be looking ahead and kind of previewing some of the bigger storylines with spring football and some other little news and updates along the way. But very happy to be back on the podcast with you guys. Jared, good to see you, my man. How are things?
Things are well, man. Things are well. Just staying busy and trying to keep my head in the pot for everything that's happening in the sports world.
Absolutely, and like I said, it's been a busy yet slow time at the same time right now as we're in that off season mode after signing day, before spring football starts. Still a lot of stuff behind the scenes going on, obviously, with the team, but mostly, as far as they're concerned, engaged now in those off season workouts and getting ready for whenever it is Oregon State spring ball starts. But before we get into the Beavs, Jared, I want to know, how was your Super Bowl?
Man, wasn't that good? I mean, I was expecting a closer game, So, but everything started going downhill, relatively quickly. It was not, too fun to watch. Tom Brady smash his way to his sixth.
So I'm assuming then you had a rooting interest and we're pulling for Casey.
I would say yes, but I respect it. Obviously, undisputable at this point. Greatest of all time. It is what it is. Uh, he's a good guy. He's not a bad guy. So I'm not mad about it. Obviously, again, he's the GOAT. So you have to appreciate it. That's what I always tell people to do with LeBron James. So that's
Yep.
the attitude I have to take towards Brady as well, is just appreciate it.
We might almost need to have a separate podcast at some point to talk about our GOAT discussion,
I'm up.
because I'm looking at the guy that says LeBron James is the GOAT, and I respect that opinion, even though, I think Michael Jordan takes that cake and runs with it. But when you're going across sports and you're talking like, Tom Brady, LeBron James, where does LeBron still take your ultimate GOAT status,
Um,
or is Tom Brady there?
yeah. I mean, I don't think LeBron. I think in terms of pure athleticism, LeBron's definitely up there, because I
Yeah.
think he could go play tight end in the NFL right now and probably be a pretty impactful player, as well as multiple other things if you wanted to. Maybe not like golf or something like that. But when you talk about goats, you've got your Tiger Woodses, you've got your Tom Brady's now, and your depending on who you ask, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Serena Williams.
Right.
There's definitely people that come to your brain right away. I think in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking about the greatest of all sports of all time, I think you've got to give it to Tom now. I just think
Yeah.
you do. He's won
Yeah.
more Super Bowls on his own than any NFL franchise, which is an
Yeah.
insane thing to say. So
Yeah, I
he's
know
got,
that I know it took us on a little bit of a divergence, but obviously this last weekend was the Super Bowl, the biggest football holiday of the year, and I was just curious to see, how you enjoyed the game, and obviously, everyone was largely, for the most part, at home and watching the game, and didn't end up being, quite the game we expected, but
no way.
that's football, and I just wanted to bring it up in the sense of, now we have to wait quite a bit until we get any sort of football back. So, you
Just
know,
say,
definitely was enjoyable to kind of soak up that last Sunday. And now I'm going to be itching for spring football, which we'll be getting to a little bit later here in this podcast.
yep. Spring's looking like it'll be a fun one. There's some question marks that will have to be answered. So it's going to be exciting. Again, like you said, it sucks that the football's over, but I'm a huge college basketball fan, so
Mm,
I'm enjoying watching all of that, and just thankful that they're able to play, and that we're looking like we're going to have a tournament and all that. It's super exciting to have that going on as well. So just gotta go with the
absolutely.
motion.
And I echo your point about basketball. I do love college basketball, but I love college basketball in the postseason and when it starts to get into the nitty gritty and, towards the end of the season.
Watching that.
Right. And for me, like how what I like to do as far as, loving basketball this time of year, I love to watch as much NBA as possible. And I like the NBA more than I like college basketball. And I
I
think that,
try, man. I
yeah.
try.
And I,
You gotta understand, with the Hawks letting me down, it's not easy. I was expecting this year to go better, and it has, but you know, there's some things that still need to be, I guess, touched on and hopefully improved throughout the season.
Hey man, I mean, it's not easy up here in Portland either. Blazers going through quite a few injuries themselves. But now that we've distracted each other for the good
Yeah.
amount of this podcast, had to get those little howdy doody things going on just to keep everyone on their toes. But into the mix and the crux of this 2021 class, Jared, just first impressions. You and I didn't get a chance to talk together on a podcast format following the 15 additions they made during the February signing period last week. I'm just kind of curious, you've read my stuff. I've read your stuff. We've had coverage wall to wall here at Beaver's Edge. I'm just kind of curious, did anything about how they wrapped up the class, at least on paper? Obviously, there's still room. They could add a guy or two. We'll get into that in a little bit too. But just from where it stands right now, were you pleased, surprised, or, pretty much just in line with how they ended up shaking this thing out?
I think it went as expected for the most part. You talk about the 15 additions, and a large sum of those were preferred walk-ons.
Yes, very much so.
And it got to a point where, as they were adding multiple a day. And I remember just getting text messages throughout, like, another PWO. I'm like, yep, another preferred walk-on. And I understand, like, everybody wants, obviously the big thing right now is everyone wants a big defensive lineman. Everybody wanted, to see some more scholarship additions, but at the same time, you got to think when they add such a large quantity of walk-ons, the way I told people to look at it is, hey, it doesn't hurt the program at all. It helps the program in a big way. And some of these guys will play out. So be excited about it. We don't know which ones yet, but just know that because of the amount they're adding, some of them will play out. Some of these guys will end up being impact guys on the field, and all of them will be impact guys off the field as well. Just as far as practice and scout team and stuff like that goes, they'll all, it's all great when you can add guys like that. But as far as the scholarship guys go, I mean, obviously the storyline was flipping Jason White from Boise State. That was a huge pickup that we actually called right after the first signing day.
I would almost give us a little bit more credit than that, Jared, and say you and I maybe even predicted this was going to happen.
We did. Yeah, we predicted it back in mid-December.
Oh, good call. Good call from you, my man.
It was exciting to see it happen. I mean, you had to know there was some kind of possibility, just seeing Oregon State was in the top 3. Boise State kind of came and swept them up rather quickly. I think they offered him in like October, and he committed shortly after, something like that.
Right.
So it happened pretty fast. And when you've got guys like that, regardless of whether they commit or not, you're going to continue building that relationship. I don't know why he decided to back off his pledge. One would assume it was because Harsin left for Auburn.
Right.
But either way, a fantastic job for Oregon State to get in and get a guy that's widely considered one of the more athletic tackles on the West Coast. So super good pickup there, like super good pickup. I think people talk about the offensive line recruiting a lot, but I've actually been super impressed with the additions. Henry Buckles being the in-state gym, and then Jason White being your kind of headliner there. Then last year's class I thought was fantastic with Fuaga and Cooper Darling as well as Marano. So I think it's been well.
Yeah, and I think you hit a lot of really great points there. And, like I said, we'd be remiss if, I think you and I almost try to mention it in just about every recruiting story that we have now. Jared and I are well conscious and we're well aware that the fan base wants a defensive lineman. That's not lost on us. It's not lost on us. Believe me, it's not. But again, and as I put in my 3-2-1 that I posted yesterday, again, check that out. It's a pretty solid read, is just whether it be the first press conference or the second press conference from Jonathan Smith, and Jared, you can back me up on this, there wasn't a concern, at least made publicly, about the defensive line. There were questions asked about depth. There were questions asked about if they'd like to add any more, not specifically to the defensive line, but in general. And time again, you go back to even December, Jonathan Smith, his real, laid out priority then was, we'd like to add another offensive lineman or two. Flash forward, they add Jason White, they add Haneli Bloomfield, and, the offensive line's relatively taken care of. Now, on the other side of that coin, I really do think it's a thing where I think the Beavers are being extremely selective, because even though there's no scholarship limit for next season, and even some fans or some subscribers on the damn board have mentioned this, so I got to give them credit as well for going down this line, line of thinking. you can't go over that mark if your athletic department doesn't have the money to pay for those scholarships.
Yeah.
And I'm not implying that Oregon State does or does not, or don't have any inside knowledge or anything with that. But I can say that for an athletic department like Oregon State's that is running a deficit right now, adding more cost to something is not something they're going to be jumping out of the stands to go do. So could there be, the notion that, maybe it's been told to Jonathan Smith, hey, you've got wiggle room for one or two guys that could really be game changers, or otherwise you're pretty much at your limit. And that's where I think they probably are, is where they've got room for one, two, maybe three. Does that number seem about right for what you've been able to gather, Jared?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's like you said, it's not just Oregon State; it's nationwide. There's
Right.
not a lot of schools that, in the time that we're in, we're going to take a gamble on adding many more people, and we don't know what the future is going to look like as far as the scholarship numbers go. So it is a gamble. So they're like you said, if there is an essential guy who could be an impact guy, they're gonna make it happen if they want to, and that's kind of what you were saying at first. We don't really we can't. It's hard to tell if they even really want to right now.
Right. And that really is and we even saw, in just the conversations on the damn board about people being like, how can they not right see that as and again, from our perspective, it's our job to, kind of put the pieces together with the information that we get. And again, I will go back to this, as I say all the time. Jonathan Smith knows what he's doing. Jonathan Smith knows how to build this program. So if it's not the perfect, fitting into the way that, we want it to fit into in this nice little neat window where, this defensive lineman commits, it's great, he's locked in, it's many months in advance. When in reality, I pointed to this yesterday, was I could see a situation where after spring, they find a defensive lineman or a defensive tackle that, maybe didn't get as high on the depth chart as he thought he was going to be, when he went in for his spring practice. Maybe they add someone over the summer. I don't know. Those kind of things happen all the time. But
exactly.
I think the overarching point that I have here is, don't get married to the idea of the Beavers absolutely having to add a defensive lineman, because I don't think the Beavers necessarily see it as a must have. Do you?
No, I think you're pretty much right on there. It's interesting because it is seemingly a position of need, but like you said, it all comes down to trusting the staff. These are the guys that lead your team in all aspects. So you've got to, if you're a fan of the team, you're of course in line by questioning things that happen, but also it's important that overall you trust the process. And if you like the staff, then just know that they've obviously got a plan. If there's a need for a defensive line, and by need I mean need, then they will address it. There's a million guys out there in the world that would love to play for Oregon State. Believe me. So if there's a guy, they'll find him. So just know that, and that's kind of why I've been, wondering, do they view it as a need?
Right.
Because there's been guys who they could have, taken a gamble on or rolled the dice on, or even like surefire guys
Right.
that you didn't really see them push for. So you've got to imagine that it's not as big of a need as the outside affluence is making it to be. So we'll see.
Right. And just kind of my last point on that, just to kind of put a bow tie on that before we, move on to, continuing to round out the class and then look ahead to spring in this edition of the Edge podcast. It's interesting to me that, I'm not going to say like the lack of news in this regard, but this just kind of leads me to believe that maybe the internal development they're expecting to be more than we are. Maybe they're putting bigger stock into that. A guy like Evan Bennett, a guy like Corey Stover, someone who maybe has made an impact, but they're like, okay, this guy can maybe, be ready to chew up some good, snaps at, D tackle or D end or whatever. I think of a guy this last year, Jared, who you and I were extremely high on, in Tavis Shippen, didn't even hardly see the field this season. Maybe special teams, maybe a couple snaps here and there. When I asked Jonathan Smith about it, there wasn't really a clear answer. So maybe he just needed a year to get his body right for, the Pac-12. But there's a guy who, heading in, where we were at this point last year, we're like, Yeah, Tavis Shippen will be a guy that can contribute on the defensive line right away.
Yep.
And he wasn't there this last year. So there is some of that, and maybe a guy like he comes on. I mentioned it in my story. If he gets medically cleared, which in my opinion would be a miracle and something to be celebrated for a long time. If Jordan Whitley is able to make his way back onto the field, given how perilous that situation looked when the first news broke, again, Jordan Whitley was a guy who took up great space, and his metrics from when he did play were really, really good. Jeremy Reichner is another guy. He's, dealt with some injuries, opted out this last year, but another body on the defensive line that I've been waiting to see for many years now, to see if he can, turn into at least a decent playmaker. Maybe not the hype of what we originally thought when he came, but still enough, I think, he's got some left in the tank. So when you combine all those factors, and then you add in a guy like Omarion Faamoy, who's going to be joining the mix as well, maybe they're happy with where they are, and they're like, okay, if there's one guy that really will bolster this unit, we'll go after him. Otherwise, we're happy with where we are.
Yeah, and again, that's kind of where it seems to be. So it's definitely a situation where you've really got to trust the process, and we'll see what happens. I'm not saying that they won't add one, but it definitely doesn't seem like they are putting as much emphasis on it as one may expect.
In case you're just joining us here on the Edge podcast, managing editor Brenden Slaughter, joined as always by my recruiting analyst Jared Halus for this edition of the Edge podcast. We're talking and putting a bow tie on Oregon State's 2021 class before we look ahead and start to look into spring football. Another thing that I just want to mention, as we're still, we're recording this podcast on a Wednesday morning, I just want to touch on it because we haven't got a chance to talk about it. Michael Petrie. Mm-hmm. Obviously now been announced as a running backs coach for the Chicago Bears. The Beavers are feverishly looking for, the replacement, and I'm sure we'll have, that information that comes to us soon. Otherwise, at this point, it's just purely guesswork, and I would be willing to bet that Jonathan Smith is talking to people we don't even have on our radar. So, that's the nature of the business and being connected and whatnot. But just real surface level with this, and I put this on the damn board, and I think you did something the same, Jared. From Oregon State's perspective, it stinks. It stings. It stinks. It's all those things. From Michael Petrie's perspective, please go and, pursue your career, because, you don't get opportunities like that very often. The opportunity to leave a program like Oregon State, where the, national recognition of success hasn't happened under Jonathan Smith. I mean, you're talking the height under Petrie has been, still 5 wins. If you can parlay that into a gig in the NFL, especially in today's offensive-centric NFL, where that's the name of the game, I'm happy for him. I'm very happy for him, and I wish him all the best because he's an awesome human being.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Petrie's obviously a guy that, I think if you ask anybody, aside from Coach Smith, who's your guy on the staff that you'd love to keep, I think he'd be at the top of most people's list. So it was obviously even NFL guys list. So it's it's certainly a stinger, like you said. He's hopefully going to have a fantastic career in the NFL now. But yeah, I mean, they definitely are going to need to hurry up and find somebody because there's a lot of work to be done now in the 2022 class, and obviously you want to get someone in to build some great relationships with all the talent that's currently in that room. Because there is some, and a lot of the reason for some of those guys being there is because they had such a great relationship with Michael Petrie. Right. So I think getting a guy in who's got that, that swagger that Petrie had, and having them just focus on those relationships and hit the recruiting trail hard, it's going to be super important. I'm sure that, obviously they've definitely assigned somebody else to target the guys that Petrie was targeting for right now.
Right.
But getting somebody in for sure. You never want there to be a question mark. So getting somebody in for sure, especially if it can be, somebody who's got that swagger, will make a big difference.
Yeah, that's a couple great points there. And the one that really stands out to me right away is the fact that you mentioned, his responsibilities. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, Petrie also held that dual title. I can't remember if it was director of recruiting or recruiting coordinator, either way, one of the two. Jared, who do you think, or actually, let me just phrase this a different way. Do you think this new running back coach will have that title, or do you think we'll see someone like Jim Mahalchek maybe get it. Maybe Jake Cookus. Maybe Brian Lindgren picks it up. I'm sure I'm missing on a couple potential names that would be, possible for that. But
Coach Blue.
that's a bit of a unique angle, isn't it? Because we've talked about it. He was given that title because he was the closer. Petrie was the closer on the recruiting trail. And that's why I said, a part of me, as happy as I am for him, I'm like, Matt Nagy, I wish you'd never heard of Michael Petrie, because, we know he's getting a good one up there. And we know you're getting a guy who he connects with the players so, so, so well. And, whether that be Jamar, whether that be AP, whether that be Tayron Madison, Isaiah Newell, Demir Collins, so on and so forth. He has brought some real talent to this backfield, and, he will be missed. But on the other side of that coin, I don't want people to think that like Jonathan Smith hired Michael Petrie away from like an SEC school to get him to come here anyway. This was a guy who was coming from Montana State and, was just kind of starting his coaching career. And, we all saw it as a great hire, but Petrie grew into the role that we've, come accustomed to him being. He grew into becoming recruiting, the recruiting guru for them and being the closer and whatnot. So with that just leads me to believe that Jonathan Smith looks for a type of coach, and then that type of coach has the ceiling to be able to get to a Petrie level. We think back, it could have went many different ways. Brian Lindgren was poached by Arizona State. Oregon State, was able to, renegotiate contracts and be able to, pay him more to stay. But Herm Edwards came after him, after that 5-7 season. And, Jonathan Smith had been talking about it forever. You're doing something right.
Exactly.
If people are taking your coaches. And in this case, Oregon State coaches don't go to the NFL very often. That's straight to the NFL. I can think of a handful, but as an assistant, nonetheless, that it just shows his body of work. And, above all else, I have no doubt Jonathan Smith will get somebody equally as hungry and, willing to, want to build this program up. The problem is it's that there's really only one Michael Petrie for how he grew into that. And that, leads into the fact that now he's coaching in the NFL. You don't just get to, pull, NFL potential coaches, out, but this is where that due diligence has to pay mind. And, it's like we were saying, Jonathan, they will probably, take their time, and then they'll land on someone who they expect to hit the ground running.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be a big hire for sure. And just get back to your question. I don't think whoever they come in, unless it's a big time hire from a guy who's already got the experience, right. I seriously doubt they'd be given that title right away, just because there is a massive responsibility that does come with it. So there's guys on the staff who could certainly be promoted to have that role next to their name as well, just like Coach Petrie did. But to me, the most important thing is just going to be finding that guy. And I think they've got some options who I'm sure they're looking at. I think it'll be a good hire. I really do. But just the anxiety at this point, like who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? Right. And we'll certainly have the recruit reaction and, all of that stuff up as well as soon as that hire is made, because we're all just as anxious as you are.
Right. And the thing to consider with this is that, you have to imagine potentially things could leak, usually in situations like this where you have just filling one person on the staff. Potentially names start to leak out, and then it's official after they've gone through, the 2-week university hiring process or whatever, that happens to be. So I imagine we're probably still, at least that away from an official announcement. But I imagine we'll start to hear some scuttlebutt, in the next, week, 2 weeks, because I guarantee you this, they will want that coach in place before spring football starts. So at the very least,
I think 2 weeks at most.
Yeah. So at the very least, I think, in the next, couple weeks, I think it's very likely to assume that we'll at least have some names or a name starting to, emerge. But that'll wrap up the Petrie conversation. And again, just want to wish my best to him, and very excited for him to be able to join Artavis up there again. Jared, that's got to be a pretty cool feeling, knowing that you're Artavis, you're up there with Ryan Nall, David Montgomery, nice little crop of backs up there, Tariq Cohen as well, some decent backs up there in Chicago. And, Artavis was a rookie this year, And, maybe you did like your running back coach, maybe you didn't. And now you get your running back coach from college to coming back and you're like, man, it's like a party all over again. I got Ryan Nall, I got Michael Petrie back in the fold, and that those kind of things don't happen. So that's just a really, really cool story.
Yeah, super cool, super cool. We'll have to see how it plays out. I'd be interested to see if Artavis is able to get some significant amount of snaps this year. Now,
Yeah, we're definitely gonna need to maybe send Petrie a message, say, hey, it's okay to give Ryan Nall and Artavis Pierce a few carries to spell David Montgomery every now and again.
Exactly.
But no, definitely wish all the best to the Petrie family. Again, just a tremendous individual, and definitely gonna miss him here in Corvallis. But just to kind of transition to our last topic, which is just starting to look ahead to spring practices, which we don't exactly have a start date yet. We have a rough timeline of when we think it's going to start, which is roughly mid to end of March, depending on, how the COVID protocols shake out, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, because naturally protocols are going to be a little bit different since they're not, competing on Saturdays against different teams. So I know that affects, the frequency of testing and all those things. So, from what I've heard, it's going to be very similar to the last, few years under Smith, where they break up this period into 2 weeks in March, take a break for spring break and finals week, and then come back and wrap up in April. So I do expect roughly that schedule to be held up again. And if that schedule holds, the biggest question and biggest storyline that will be asked about day one is the quarterback, because, following the information and the timelines that we were given in December, Tristan Gebbia will not be ready by the start of spring practices. He certainly could make a turn and could be, but I remember Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren, several others saying it would be, probably the latter half that he would get back, the April half. And when you're able to combine the finals week and spring week break, that gives him more time. Jared, how much of an important quarterback is this one of the most important quarterback springs that Oregon State's had in a long time, just given that nobody is the clear-cut guy, but yet there's plenty of talent in that room.
There certainly is, and it's going to be interesting because I've always been a big advocate for Chance, but I've also, I watched Bengal Branson in high school. I obviously know how talented and how high of a ceiling Sam Vidlak has. So it's going to be a battle, and we've said that before. I think we've even said it on the podcast already. It's going to be a battle, and certainly there's a big level of importance that's going to come with it. Of course, we hope that it'd be great if there wasn't some kind of battle and Tristan was able to heal up and solidify that spot. That's what you want to happen, and that's what those times are for someone to solidify themselves as the guy. But if he's not able to, then certainly we're in for a big competition this spring. And I think it was shaping up that way anyways.
Right.
I don't want to say that it was going to be anyone's job heading into the season, regardless of how last season ended. But yeah, it's awesome. It's super cool because it's a great storyline for spring, and it's going to keep everyone super plugged in. So it'll be interesting to see what unfolds, because I think that you really got to start giving Ben a look this year, just because he's had that full year now with the team. Obviously, I think if you look at names mentioned in practice, he's always a guy that's like.
Well, Jared, just from what I was able to see myself before last spring got shut down, because the Beavers had, I want to say, 2 or 3 practices when I was there in person, in March last year before, the last year happened. And I remember like day 1, day 2, Bengal Branson was turning some heads with Zariah Beeson. No shock. And we all know what Zariah Beeson turned out to be later in the year. And it's one of those things where I think I mentioned this to you. Right now, Tristan Gebbia is the only quarterback on the roster that's won Oregon State a game.
Yeah.
So that's something to be considered too, right? Chance Nolan, he comes into the equation as being a very mobile option and can launch that deep ball. The things that Chance Nolan brought to the table, while Oregon State didn't win, were uniquely different and almost kind of exciting than what Tristan Gebbia brought to the table. Then you toss in Bengal Branson, who, again, another guy who just, we got a chance to see him really late in the year. And even though he only played, limited snaps, his metrics were off the charts in that Arizona State game. Granted, again, limited sample size, but looked really, really good. And then you add in the real wild card, which is, Sam Vidlak just casually decides to enroll early to get ready for this competition, knowing full well that right now there's no guy. It's not clear cut. There's maybe a favorite, maybe a guy who's got the most experience, but it's wide open. And that's the thing that's most exciting for me, Jared, is obviously you've only, been with Edge for a couple years, but going back, I can't remember a quarterback battle at Oregon State with this much talent in the room from top to bottom. And that's where Beaver fans get excited, because we've got some quarterbacks in this room that I think could do some really special things.
Yeah, and you saw it kind of last year with after Tristan got hurt, and I think one of the themes of last season was just the fact that we saw progression from him pretty much every game. He got better as the season went on, and then Chance, he obviously came in and filled in, and we watched him get better too. And just getting back to that last point, and practices and in camps, Bengal Branson's a name that pops up a lot. Sam Vidlak obviously needs no introduction. We've talked plenty about him, just getting to your point, he did want to stay for his senior year, but you see some opportunity.
You kind of get that. You kind of almost get like that Grinch smile a little bit, where you're just like,
right,
all right, let's see what happens here.
Exactly. But regardless, I mean, even if he doesn't win the job, because I mean, let's face it, the odds are not in his favor.
Of course.
It's still invaluable
to be there. Oh yeah,
that he's going to get this spring, and just being with the team, being in college, learning how to be a student and balance that before he jumps right in for the season. It's going to be huge for him. And they're shaping up. I mentioned this in the story yesterday. They're shaping up to be successful at that position for years to come, which is obviously a massive thing,
right?
Especially in a towards the end of what most people would call a pretty big rebuild. So great to see, and I think they're making big steps to make it happen. Even though there's no solidified guy, when you've got depth like that, at any position, it makes a lot of fun.
And here's the devil's advocate, because there would be someone even on our board who would maybe pose this question, and it's an interesting question to me right now. It's at the end of spring, are all those quarterbacks there? At the end of fall, are all those quarterbacks
about
there?
That yesterday.
Right. And that is something where I'm like, it's interesting.
I'd say yes.
Yeah, I mean, right now you'd probably say yes, and I think I probably would too, because I think all four of these guys are super invested in wanting to be Oregon State's guy. But I go back a couple years ago, I never thought Marcus McMaryion would transfer, and after in 2016 leading Oregon State to a couple victories, and then the following year the coaching staff wants to go with Jake Luton, and obviously as Jake Luton's in the NFL now, that talent-wise may have been
the right.
I'm not going to blame him for that decision, because the guy's in the NFL. But Marcus McMaryion was another guy who was like, okay, at the start of August, took off and then went and won, I think, somewhere around 20 games the next 2 years for Fresno State as their quarterback. So even in that case, those quarterbacks can leave late. He left pretty late in the fall camp, basically when he didn't win the job. So I don't think there's a lot of that with this group. I think all of these guys are pretty hungry and pretty humble to wanting to, win and be the kind of outstanding, quarterbacks and, leaders on the team that, the Beavers want them to be. But in either case, it's one guy can play quarterback, right? And the thing is, like, you're talking about Jebbia, who's going to come back as a junior. Chance Nolan's going to come back as a sophomore. And then two guys who are basically the same, essentially, with, I guess Sam Vidlak coming in as a true freshman, but Bengal Branson's basically going to be a true freshman again this year. So, it's divides nicely, but it just makes you wonder, how long can you hang on to all of them?
Mm-hmm. It certainly does. And it's going to be like we've said, it's going to be an interesting battle. I don't think we'll see attrition at that position this year, at least not after spring. Maybe, if things don't go well throughout summer workouts or something like that, then it could become more of a possibility. You get another chance in fall camp. So, hopefully we see everybody stay to give themselves another chance. And I really think that will happen. I don't expect any attrition, but yeah, there's a lot of talent in the room, and definitely guys that could potentially go play elsewhere. So hopefully that won't happen. I don't think it will, but it's a good problem to have.
Absolutely. And, it's not just quarterback where we're going to have some battles. I mean, you talk about running back where you're going to have Deshaun Fenwick and BJ Baylor competing, for that starting job. I'm very excited to see how that, position breaks down.
Me too.
I'm excited to see where Micaiah Tongue, checks into the receiver room, with,
Who's got potential to be really good.
Right. And that's what I mean is Oregon State's got some really nice and varying pieces. And you look at a guy like Tongue, you're like, oh, wow, there's your Hodgins-esque sized receiver.
Yeah.
And you look this last year, the Beavers were missing that very much. So that's another, guy I'm really excited to see. I'm excited to see, how quickly like Henele Bloomfield is able to acclimate. Is he a guy that's going to push for immediate playing time like Jonathan Smith said he was, the former Utah State transfer? And then even on the other side, the Beavers added a lot of pieces, obviously with, David Morris announcing his medical retirement. There's a spot for grabs. I mean, of sorts. I mean, he didn't play the whole year, but some potential reps at safety there and, guys moving around quite a bit in that back secondary is, Jaden Grant played some safety and, Alton Julian played some safety. So, there's a lot of, unique competitions and we could do a whole podcast, might have to just before spring football starts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about each position, but, surface level before we get into that down the line, there's a lot of competition. And I'd say this is maybe the most important spring under Jonathan Smith.
Yep. It's certainly, looking like there's going to be a lot of competition. There's some question marks that will need to be answered, but it's all good. And I think the team's got potential to be the best team this year that we've seen in the past few years. I think the last year of Luton was full of potential that we didn't see fulfilled. Talent-wise, that was an incredibly talented team, and they could have outperformed the record that they had by a lot. But this year, there's a lot of potential as well. I feel like offensively, there's a lot of strength. Offensive line's looking pretty good. The quarterback, like we said, it's a good problem to have. No, there's not a solidified starter, but there's talent in that room. Running back the same, no solidified guy, but there's talent in that room. Wide receiver, we've gotten some fantastic transfers at the position. In Tongue and Harrison last year, Beeson turning into a sophomore who already has made waves as a freshman. So offensively, things are looking really good. Defensively, I feel relatively good about things as well. But yes, it's an important spring. Again, we'll dive into each of the positions at a later date once things get closer. But man, it's an exciting time.
Certainly. And I think we gave ourselves a pretty good idea for a podcast, in advance of spring football. So that's going to be exciting to get into as Jared and I can kind of study up on the position group, especially when they release, a spring roster and that's all updated. And, there'll be, maybe an addition or a subtraction or, all those kind of things that go along with a given offseason. But before we, wrap up this edition of the Edge podcast, Jared, I'm just curious for you. Of all the things we've talked about, this is kind of the tease that I want to leave for everybody. What has you most excited about this team heading into spring?
I think honestly that what I was just getting at, I think the potential of this offense is more than we've seen in a while. Obviously, that 2019 season with Luton and Hodge and AP and all those guys was a great season. There was a lot of seniority on that offense, and that's why I think they were so good, super consistent. But this year, I just see so much. I see the ceiling being raised almost.
Right.
Like those guys were fantastic, and we're obviously a great offense. Why most of them are in the NFL now, but I see the same thing happening for these guys, and they're all young.
Yep.
And that's the beauty of it. So if we could see just some hints this year, it can only get better. So it's always good when you can only go up.
Right. And that's the thing is, despite this year, which again, I don't call it a throwaway year. I just almost call it like an at-risk year where, all the factors that happened off the field this year played into, this year. And I almost don't, I've seen some fans on like the damn board be like, did the Beavers take a step back by going 2-5 this last year? No, because it was a COVID year, in my opinion. And I don't think you can necessarily put too much stock into, or not enough, like both sides of it, with what happens, during a COVID year, and everything that happened, and the Beavers lost spring and everything else. So for me, I'm most excited to see this team have a full spring. And I look back to last year, getting spring cut out from under them, then not being able to start fall camp until, goodness, I can't remember when fall camp did start. Was it September? I think. Yeah, it's like it's sorry, many months ago. I'm having to rack the brain back. But after, they canceled Pac-12 football and then put it back on, and then, brought it back, there were just a lot of things that were going on this year. A lot of things that are still going on right now. And I don't use that as an excuse. I just say simply that it's something that you have to look at when you're looking at the context of the season. So for me, I'm excited for them to have a really full spring session, really hone in on anything that they want to, kind of tweak a little bit. Spring's great for tweaking potential sets or things like that. And, I'm also excited to see who's going to break out, because
Yeah.
every year, whether it be fall camp or spring, typically more in fall camp, a guy like Zariah this last year, but even Zariah, had his moments in spring too. I'm curious to see who's going to break out, because I think there are some guys on this team that are very hungry. And, I know for a fact there are guys on this team, the majority of this team, if not all of this team, is disappointed with how they played this last year and
Yeah.
want to, get to a bowl game. That is still the goal of this program, amidst the rebuild. So very excited, to see how all that kind of comes together and crystallizes, over the next few months. So that'll go ahead and wrap it up for this edition of the Edge Podcast. Big shout out to my co-host Jared Halus for joining us as always. Jared, that was a fun podcast, man.
Yeah.
Being able to kick back and talk some Beaver football with you.
Absolutely. It's always fun. Always fun.
So that'll go ahead and do it for us on this edition of the Edge Podcast. Make sure to keep it tuned to beaversedge.com for all the latest. Again, Jared and I will have coverage of Oregon State's running back coach hire whenever they, announce that. We'll have continued updates on recruiting. We'll have basketball updates as they continue to come through. Baseball starting up soon as well. I know a lot of Edgers are really excited for the baseball season, and that's going to be exciting here in the, coming weeks as they get down to Surprise. So lots of stuff coming up at beaversedge.com. You want to keep it locked. Jared and I will take care of you guys with content. So for this edition of the Edge Podcast, for Jared Halus, I'm Brenden Slaughter signing off.